right. Hello, everyone. Hello and welcome. I think my microphone's on. Can everybody hear? All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited to have you here and for this very important day and this release of this very important event. I have to say it's really exciting to look out and see a crowd of people that I don't always see at our events. So again, this just tells me that we are expanding our community, expanding our network, and we're just very, very happy to have everybody here today. My name is Mary Alice McCarthy, and I direct the Center on Education and Skills here at New America. I have the pleasure and honor of kicking off today's event, which includes the release of this excellent report on the future of work for people with disabilities and a discussion among some leading experts in the field. So I just want to share a few thoughts to kick us off today. First, I want to thank Shane Kennedy and all the folks from SourceAmerica for reaching out to us about the work they've been doing on this important topic. We've really enjoyed being a part of this process and look forward to future conversations. So thank you, Shane, and thank you, SourceAmerica. And second, I just want to share a little background about New America's work and perspective on the future of work. For those of you not familiar with us, New America is a public policy think and do tank. We do actually do more than think. We're actually out in the field doing quite a bit of interesting work. And we are committed to American renewal during this time of very profound change and polarization. Core to our efforts at renewing America is our quest to help our country live up to its highest ideals, including equality and opportunity for all, aspirations that we have too often fallen short of in our history, right? And keeping those ideals close as we embark in this new and uncertain period in which the world of work is being transformed in ways both good and bad, it really couldn't be more important. So New America has been engaged in discussions on the future of work for some time now. Like most think tanks, we've had a future of work initiative going for a number of years, trying to really sort of tackle and think through what it means to prepare the country for a future of work that looks different than the current of work. So in 2015, we launched the Shift Commission, and that was a multi-year effort through which we engage stakeholders across a wide variety of domains: business and labor, education, government agencies, community-based organizations, to try to envision the likely impacts of automation on our society. And I will say a big takeaway from this work is that there is no future of work, but rather many potential futures, depending on the policies we choose to respond and shape to the impact of different technologies. Right? Another big takeaway from our early research on the future of work was that the conversation was overly focused on certain workers in certain occupations, particularly men in male-dominated occupations like truck driving and manufacturing, while the conversation was paying too little attention to jobs in the administrative and retail sectors, which employ many more women and people of color, and I would venture to say workers with disabilities. So that observation about who was being left out of the conversation and who we weren't paying enough attention to led us to do a deeper dive on the impacts of automation of workers in those sectors and to really spend time and lean in and do some deep ethnographic research to understand how workers were experiencing the workplace, how they were experiencing technological change at the workplace, and what they were thinking about in terms of their concerns and anxieties around the future. So last November, we put out a report called Worker Voices, Technology and the Future of Workers. And I feel like that report, as I read that and read the SourceAmerica report, I saw many overlaps and areas of sort of shared concern, which again said to me that when you start with the populations who are most vulnerable and most likely to be affected by rapid technological change in the workplace, you do see some similar themes emerge. So three big themes that I saw in the SourceAmerica report that we've also found in our own research is, number one, that the future is here already, right? For many workers, I really saw this in the SourceAmerica report. For many workers, the future is already here in the sense that they feel that their connection to work is precarious and fragile. And that in today's labor market, when people lose connections to work, it's very hard for them to get back in, okay? And we know that this is true in the disability, for workers with disability, that labor force participation rates have never recovered from prior to the Great Recession and continue to be a real problem. So that's a common theme that we also saw through our research. A second theme that I saw, and that we certainly had hammered home for us, is that education and training are only part of the answer, right? Access to affordable and high-quality programs to develop and keep up skills will be important for future workers. And technology can help make education more widely accessible. But education and training on their own are not enough to address key drivers of exclusion in the future. Things like discrimination, all right, which has an outsized impact on many vulnerable populations, as well as the lack of sufficient labor protections and support, particularly in new parts of our gig economy, where employment arrangements are often quite different and less protected. And then the third big theme that I think we all share is that we all know that technology can cut in many ways. There's often, in the future of work conversations, they can flip between one side to the other. There's a determinism in some cases to the conversation. Jobs are going to be destroyed. There's nothing we can do about it, so we better just, get ready and think about how we're going to sort of distribute revenue differently. Or there's sort of a rosy optimism of like, technology is going to be fantastic and everybody's going to benefit and everyone's going to be able to participate. And for those of us in the education space, that's been a big sort of thing in educational technology too, that it would solve all of these access problems, okay? And none of that has been the case, right? And this brings me to, the reality is that I think we all know is that policy, or the lack of policy, has always shaped who benefits and how from technology. So this brings me to my last point, which is that whoever is not at the table on discussions of the future of work is going to be left out of policies aimed at shaping the impact of technology and automation, and that's not good, which is why today's paper and today's event is so important. More than 50 million Americans live their lives with some form of disability, nearly 1 in 5 individuals. But as our friends at SourceAmerica have rightly called out, the future of workers with disabilities has rarely been at the center of the conversation, and that's a big mistake. We simply cannot make good policies if the needs of 50 million Americans are not taken carefully into account when we think about the future. So I hope today's event and conversation is a step toward making sure future conversations around the future of work are more inclusive. With that, let me again thank you all for being here today, and thanks SourceAmerica, and let me please introduce you to Mr. Shane Kennedy, who's been the mastermind of this whole process and is the reason we're all here today. For those of you who don't know Shane, he is the Vice President of Workforce Development at SourceAmerica, and in this position, Shane has focused on the economic and social inclusion of persons with disabilities. And with that, I think I'll just hand it over to you, Shane. Thank you very much.
Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to this event. Couldn't express our appreciation any more for you taking the time out of your day to be here for this conversation. So, as Mary Alice was saying, the great kind of synergy between some of the work that New America has been doing, some of the things that SourceAmerica has been doing, but it's not exclusively about what SourceAmerica has been doing or this report as a product of any of our work. It's a collective effort of working across the community to express some of these ideas and to bring some awareness and visibility to something that we all collectively think is very important. So we want to express our gratitude to New America for hosting this event and being a great partner throughout this as well. So a little bit about SourceAmerica. We are an independent 501c3 nonprofit organization based in the United States. We have a nationwide network of community-based service providers underneath us, around 700 of them. Each one has their own unique mission, but the unifying kind of factor between all of that is employment and working with the disability community. So we do a number of things at SourceAmerica, but one of those things is research, and to try and be a leader in some of these conversations, but also mostly an enabling force in something positive happening as a result of it, not just talking about it, but what can we do from there. And I'd like to acknowledge that our president and CEO, Mr. Vince Luce, is here today, so appreciate him coming as well. All right, as well as many of the people that worked on this report and helped to plan and execute this event, so very appreciative of them. So I'd like to start out by framing the issue. Mary Ellis talked about some of the stats, some of the things that we see kind of universally out there. When we talk about the future of work, we're talking about the intersection between the social, legislative, economic, and technological factors that are shaping how, when, and where we all engage with work. And that's a universal theme, right? That's impacting people on a broad scale generally. But very often do populations who are traditionally underrepresented in many of the economic measures of success and some of the things that we kind of think about when we think about the labor market are often left out of that conversation entirely. When we did our initial report in 2018, kind of the baseline of what we were looking at were a number of long-term trends that we found to be very problematic and very concerning for the future. Things like 36% decline in the number of people who are not working but actively looking for work, right? 36% of people are no longer looking for work because they are discouraged by the current economic situation or by their association with the labor market and opportunities that they see for themselves there. A 10% increase in the number of people out of the labor market, number of persons with disabilities out of the labor market. And most concerning was a 20-year decline in the labor market activity rate, which is the number of people who have worked 52 hours in a year or more. So 52 hours is a very small amount of time to have worked within a year. Over a 20-year period, that number dropped by over 50% for persons with disabilities, right? And that was a long-term, very concerning trend that we saw and really kind of raised that awareness for us. At the same time, within our report, we looked at the current legislative and social trends that were really impacting the community and this expression, this expectation of greater inclusion throughout the labor force. Right, a long-term kind of fight in that direction to be recognized that inclusion should be our first mindset, right? When it comes to work, when it comes to education, when it comes to any of these facets of society, that persons with disabilities should be equally included in those conversations. But that expectation, followed by policy, is exerting a lot of pressure on a lot of different actors to fulfill that promise. Right? And right now, the systems are not really oriented in a way to successfully produce the level of outcomes that we all universally expect and desire. So that was another contributing factor for talking about this subject. And that was before we even got to the future of work conversation, right? That's just the current reality and situations and long-term trends. Now, if you look at the future of work, a lot of the research that had been out by the time that we did our initial report really kind of honed in on a number of areas, a number of characteristics of people who might be most disproportionately impacted by technological unemployment, right? Based on educational attainment levels, based on prevalence of being in poverty, based on the predisposition to work in occupations that were highly automatable. When you looked at that, it matched a generalized profile of persons with disabilities in the United States. Right? And we recognize the inherent danger of generalizing any population, but based on the data that we have available and based on some of the research around future of work, we saw a correlation there that we thought was very concerning, especially when you take into account that persons with disabilities were nowhere in the conversation about the future of work. Right? So from there, we really wanted to be a bridge to help engage the community in that conversation and see how we could work collectively across the broader community to really have a voice in this emerging area of research and policy and everything that's going to flow from it. Okay? And it's only been within the past year and a half that Future of Work has been on the agenda for disability community events. If you look at the most recent Harkin Summit, if you look at the International Labor Organization Global Business and Disability Network event that just occurred, Future of Work is now popping up, and that's a very exciting thing. But when we go to Future of Work events generally, disability is still not really in the conversation. Right? So that's kind of a framing of the problem area, how we approach this from the outset. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the project itself before we talk about some of the outputs that you all had a chance to take a look at today. So in thinking about these problems, then the natural question is, so what can be done about this, right? So many different people acting upon the disability community, acting within the disability community, a lot of just different interests, a lot of different mission orientations, a lot of different kind of compelling reasons to do things. In some cases, those are canceling each other out and not achieving the level of progress that we would all desire. So we wanted to start by actually having an understanding of the complexity of the situation that we're talking about. So often we launch into these systems change initiatives without first understanding the system itself to know what it is that we're proposing to change. So that was our starting point. How do you go about actually doing that for something as complex as what we're talking about? So we figured we'd assemble as many divergent perspectives on the topic as possible, that we would organize their efforts under a human-centered design framework, and have a shared goal of shaping a more inclusive future. Doesn't sound daunting at all, right? Not at all. So fortunately, we got connected to the lab at OPM within the Office of Personnel Management, and their design instructors, their design educators specialize in this level of complexity, right? So with them, we found a willing collaborator to think about what is this problem area, how can we assemble a collection of different perspectives and do so in kind of a traditional setting of having meetings, but then extend that in a virtual way to get even more perspective as we go through it. How do we do that in a way that actually gets us to an end state that we can look at and say, now we have a better understanding, now we have some ideas for what to do. So that was a process that we engaged in over a number of months to kind of co-design those different work sessions and really leaned on their expertise for how you bring in design education along with research, along with guest speakers, along with different panel events. And New America hosted one of those events here. How do you bring those together in such a way that you're enhancing the process, but getting as much perspective as you possibly can for something that there's certainly a lot of opinions about, right? So over the course of the 4 workshops, we had an inclusive core working group that we had assembled, and a number of subject matter experts and guest advisors that we brought together. And when we would go through these sessions, we would do work in-house, and we would then go out to a virtual advisory committee to share that work to get more perspective to feed back into the process. The result, from our perspective, is a major community effort, and we're very proud to have been a part of it. So moving on to the outputs and some of the outcomes. So this marks the next milestone in the process. This is not the end of the process. This event for the release of this report. So you have a copy of the executive summary report when you came in, but the full report is actually available on our website as well, which is about 4 times as long as the executive summary, with all of the detail in it. And in that full report, you will see a number of things. You're going to see a stakeholder map where we tried to identify as many of the generalized groups that are acting within this community that we could across a number of domains. You'll also see very extensive system maps where we looked at the causal relationships and the behaviors that are occurring that are bringing us to the present state and some of those trends and some of those statistics that I mentioned, right? It's through the actions of actors within that entire ecosystem that we arrive at the numbers that we're currently at. But it's also through that we can look at what are opportunities for changing our behavior in the future to get to the outcomes that we actually desire. The system maps are broken down into 3 core narratives. You'll see that in your executive summary report: stigma and discrimination, poverty and isolation, and and underemployment. We looked at it through a negative lens because we wanted to be realistic about, this is a problem. There are issues that are happening. We could have taken a neutral stance or a more positive stance on it, but we felt that did a disservice to the problem statement that we were creating. And then within each of those core narratives, you then have very specific, very defined sub-narrative maps of the relationships that are happening when you look at things like accommodations and access to work and the education systems and public and nonprofit employment systems, trying to break down those things and couple that with some degree of research. And one of the challenges that we had was to keep all of that at a similar level of detail as we're talking about it. Understanding that in each of those subjects, you could dive deep into that and write extensive reports about any of those things, right? But we wanted to create a foundation of understanding. So most importantly, coming from all of that, right, where do we go from here? So within that, there are 6 core recommendations that were put forward by the group. And this is, the perspectives of this collective body that came together to express these ideas. And the different recommendations really span a spectrum of how ambitious we're being, right? from reimagining how disability policy is created in the first place by using artificial intelligence as a decision-making tool, as opposed to a point of fear of taking over jobs, to reimagining the education system and how that connects with someone's lifelong journey through employment and what happens post-employment, to build a continuity where you take away some of the confusing aspects of those sorts of things and really enable an individual's success through that. So the idea is to take those recommendations to harness the energy of what we've done so far and the groups that participated in this project, and now those who are interested as a result of this event or subsequent things that we might do. How do we come together to make some of those ideas a reality? If those aren't the right ideas, let's find the right ideas, but any steps that we take towards those goals is progress. And that's what we really want to initiate. How do we go from here to creating progress through policies, through programs? And then my last kind of closing remark before we turn it over to the panel discussion, there's an urgent need to ensure that diverse groups are represented within the future of work context, right? And as Mary Alice said, if you are not at the table, you are not likely to receive the benefits of any of the activities that come out of this. And we find that when we go to Capitol Hill and we're advising Senate and House offices around inclusive labor policy, it's not about disability employment policy. It's about labor policy. It's about expanding our idea of who is in the labor market and who creates value. So I would say that this concept that we did, this project, the report that resulted from it, is hopefully a reference point for work in a more expanded way around inclusion in the future labor market that we would love to be a part of as well. So with that, I'd like to key up our panel that we have. So we have a number of folks who participated throughout the project who are great collaborators, partners, but they have such a diverse perspective on all of these topics, really to hear from them. So kind of to start that out, I'd like to really introduce first Mika Cross, who is our moderator. And as the panelists come up, they can make themselves comfortable. But Mika, she is the Vice President of Employer Engagement with FlexJobs. And she is a human capital expert, a speaker, a strategist, and an innovator. And she's also a veteran of the United States Army with 20 years of dedicated public service. So Mika is going to be our moderator. And with that, I'd like to invite the rest of the panelists up as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I was talking to Shane and the rest of the panelists in the green room just a few minutes ago about how incredibly excited I was to be a part of this event. In fact, I didn't sleep very well last night, in part because it is such an incredible honor to be here professionally, as I work with employers of all types, sizes, industries, from mom and pop startups, entrepreneurs, to Fortune 500 and 100 nonprofit academia, in thinking about ways to connect with underrepresented talent and how to leverage future of work kinds of arrangements to meet their talent acquisition needs and augment their workforce. But also because I was a part of this amazing project, and I got to work and collaborate with some of the most amazing advocates, policymakers, and brilliant innovators that I've really come across in my entire career. And personally, because I am in the throes of being an advocate and also parenting a middle school student with neurodiverse challenges himself. So it is near and dear to my heart to be here and to help showcase all of the recommendations that are included in this report and also highlight the expertise of the panel that I have the honor of speaking with today. So again, thank you, Shane. Thank you, New America and SourceAmerica, for including us. But let's get to it. I thought I'd make a quick introduction to each one of the panelists, and then we could talk a little bit about their expertise, passion, and background as it relates to some of the areas and experience during the project and how it relates to the future of work and persons with disabilities and the recommendations that you'll find within the summary. So to my left, I'll start with you, Jonathan, who is an innovative thought leader. He is a Forbes columnist, who authors Mindset Matters. If you haven't checked it out, be sure to do that. He's also a professor, has been a White House policy advisor, and I could go on and on, but I'm going to move on to the rest of the panel so we can get onto the conversation and then make time for your questions as well. Next up is Isabel Hodge, who is also a fellow veteran, although she hails from the Marine Corps, and currently the executive director and Vice President of Disabled People's International North American Caribbean for U.S. International Council on Disabilities. Isabel has worked all across government, has been at the highest levels, is serving on many advisory boards and committees to advocate for individuals with disabilities on an international scale. Thank you, Isabel, for being here. And Elena Silva, Director of Pre-K through 12 for the Education Policy here at New America. So Elena oversees education policy here and spent the last 20 years working on education research and policy for a variety of organizations and initiatives, and so incredibly thrilled to have your expertise here as well.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Dr. Scott Michael Robertson, who is a policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Labor Employment-Related Supports Team of the Office of Disability Employment, ODEP, and has been working on a number of Future of Works initiatives.
Public policy.
Public policy. Thank you so much. And is also an autistic adult and has been advocating for other individuals with neurodiverse issues and challenges as well. Super excited to have him here. He's been an advocate for apprenticeship programs and inclusive models of employment. And so let's give all of our panelists a warm round of applause. So let's get on to our first question, which again is talk a little bit about maybe your experience. I'll start with you, of course, Jonathan, about your experience during the project, how your areas of expertise relates to the future of work, and some of the findings maybe in the summaries of the reports and recommendations as well.
I think I have to begin. I am the professional stranger, since I'm, part of my training is as an anthropologist. So for me, everything is sort of coming from a sociocultural standpoint and trying to understand the culture of work and think about not only work. It's interesting, the title. This is about disability and the future of work. I actually would reverse it. I would say it's the future of work and disability, because my philosophy has always been that disability is part of the human experience. And when we think about disability, it is the essence of diversity. It runs across race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomics, sexual orientation. It is part of who we are. So we can't talk about work without talking about the lived experience of disability. And it is critical that we add that as part of our journey through this process. And if we're lucky enough to age, we all become part of this community. So in fact, we have to think about the process of work and how we look at the lived experience of disability and connect those. And that, for me, has always been something that I have advocated, I've thought about, and part of my, I do a lot of things. And one of the things that I've really focused on is I'm a practicing psychotherapist and executive coach, so I see the minutia of work, not the high level. And I have entrepreneurs, founders, people who just go to work and think about, and then whether it be Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000 executives, and they talk about the day-to-day of what it means to be in the trenches and actually work. What do I need to talk about? How do I think about it from an HR standpoint? How do I think about accessibility and adaptation? These are things that are going to come up time and time again. And then it's also sort of the question of mental health. And how do we think about health and well-being? And as the culture of work and as work changes, what does that mean? I think in many ways, I sort of go back to, I'm very influenced, if any of you have seen me speak, by a 10th century philosopher by the name of Sadhya Gaon. And he always said, the question is often more important than the answer. And many times we are going to have more questions than answers. And I think it's important that we ask those questions, because as we look at this from a design model, how are we going to think about designing the world of work, and what will it look like going forward?
Absolutely.
And I think that's something that we can never stop asking. I think that answers it. And I love the introduction, because I wish I was introduced that, like that every day at my dinner table. It would make life a lot easier, but I'm the lowest end of the totem pole.
I can come to New York anytime, so
Yeah.
just let me know. And Isabel, thoughts about your expertise, your work on the project, and thoughts about how your areas of expertise really relates to the future of work in persons with disabilities. Maybe anything else that Jonathan had you think about as he was giving his opening statement.
Yeah, I'm very known on social media for saying, please ask the right questions, so I really appreciated that. So my personal experience, I have a son that's 28 years old who has had to navigate the vocational rehabilitation system as an autistic adult. We've also had to obviously advocate the special education system and the transition to work, and all of those wonderful challenges have really led to me to feel like I have a little bit of expertise in that area. It was really neat this morning. I was so grateful because I knew I was going to have this event. I said, well, okay, we're going to have to get an Uber for Alistair to be able to get home. So just that, when we talk about technology, just that having that app available so that I can schedule him a ride home addresses a lot of the transportation barriers that I would have had 15 years ago. We wouldn't have been able to do this. Yeah. So it's really remarkable that the way tech has supported, not just accommodations in the workplace, but also the transportation issue too. My personal experiences, I am a person with a disability, and I worked in the federal government for many, many years, and I never felt that I could disclose my disability. I was working at the Department of Defense. But I was working in the Office of Special Needs, which you think you should be able to talk to people about your disability there, but I really never felt that comfortable. But the opportunities that it gave me was I was able to use the workforce recruitment program to find qualified and skilled people to bring into the Department of Defense as either interns or eventually to hire them. And I'll talk a little bit about the workforce recruitment program, but I had that experience. And then as an employer, I always look to hire the people with disabilities first. And I always challenge myself, who in this pool of candidates has the most challenging needs, that needs a job that I know how to accommodate because I've had the experience of working at the Department of Defense, the experience of working at the Department of Health and Human Services in the disability field. So I always challenge myself as an employer to make sure that I give opportunities to the person with the least likelihood of employment. Yeah. So that's important.
Elena.
Sure. So I'm the education person here, and even in the process, which I very much enjoyed, ended up being that voice or trying to be that voice. And initially when Shane asked, and we were discussing my being part of this process, and I was like, well, I'm more of like a pre-K-12 person. Not really work. I work with work people, not really my thing. And he's like, that's okay, that's important, and it is, and I recognize that. I think we did together. So I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it, and that is my perspective. And what I'll share is, as Mary Alice noted, I think we have a big emphasis at New America on both education and work, and we see them as intersecting and overlapping. Normally, though, in the education space, you talk about how you're preparing students for work. That's the direction in which the conversation goes. We talk about college and career-ready standards and assessments and so forth, but it's all in that direction, that we're preparing students for work. And there's not a lot of attention, although we try to do that quite a bit here because our work intersects so much, about how the workforce, employers, businesses, work in general, needs to do more than just like sort of glance back and be like, why aren't you doing a better job of preparing these kids, but actually be more engaged in what's happening in education, because the workforce will be changing. The future of work through technological change, social change, all these things are going to matter for the future of work. But for the future of workers, it's the future of education. You're going through this process in order to end up at a place, whether or not the future of education is improved, whether or not it's strong, which students it serves well. All of those things really matter for the future of work and just in general for our society. So I've been, in my career, very committed to public education, continue to be, and very, very honored to be a part of this conversation, both personally and professionally. It's of interest. And I think that the other thing I'll say, just related to the recommendations, I'm sure we can go into this more, is that what we have in place right now, so you've gone through the special ed system, this is the way you talk about it, however you might talk about it. For folks who have touched that system, you start to figure it out. For people who have gone through that system, you kind of know it. But most people don't understand that system. It's very difficult to navigate. So fundamentally, we have a system for students with disabilities starting at birth. Like, we have laws in place to serve children from birth upwards through voc rehab into the workplace, and those systems are really misaligned. There's all sorts of fallout points. The system makes no sense to anybody. I mean, if you've been in IEP meetings, if you've actually tried to make it work, you can spend half your life, all your job, trying to figure that out, and it mostly doesn't make sense. And people know that, and that's why they nod, like, yeah, parents, teachers, administrators, community members, therapists, health professionals, you name it. So the problem is quite clear. What we're going to do about it, I think, is less so, and we got to dig in this process into that problem in particular. So I appreciate that, and happy to talk more about it.
Thank you so much. And Scott.
Yeah, thank you. I want to say how much I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak on this panel and to have had the opportunity to engage in collaboration on this project on the future of work. And I feel strongly that it interrelates to our year-long celebration of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is culminating in July 26th. It will be the official 30th anniversary of the ADA. This is some of my colleagues here from the Office of Disability Employment Policy are working on that, and we'll have more to share at ODEP's website at www.dol.gov/ODEP if you want to learn more about that in the coming months. And future work is a great part of that conversation on realizing and actualizing the ideals and values of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act, and the dream of economic self-sufficiency, integrated community living, integrated employment, and other aspects of being able to have full access to all opportunities that all Americans enjoy. And as this future work is changing with automation, changing technology, artificial intelligence, et cetera, that's going to have a major impact on people with disabilities. And for one example on that is the impact on people with developmental disabilities. As an autistic person, and I also know and work alongside many colleagues and friends who are also autistic and have neurodivergence, it's one example of many disabilities that are going to be strongly impacted by the changes in the service system and technology. And I think for having this conversation now, we can get ahead of it, and we can make sure that it becomes a positive, that we can be using technology and the changes in the future of work when we're focused explicitly on people with disabilities and the lived experience to make sure there's scaffolding and structure so we can be tapping the talents and skills of people with disabilities. I look at it as an opportunity when we've had so many challenges with folks being underemployed and unemployed, and we can kind of spin this on its head and be like, what can we address for here on the challenges to make sure that we actually improve those opportunities, about giving opportunities to people with disabilities. And just like all folks without disabilities already have opportunities to enjoy gainful employment opportunities. And these sessions that we had, and I want to thank especially SourceAmerica and New America and the lab at OPM had hosted us for these design sessions. It gave us a great opportunity to be thinking outside of the box and to be iteratively designing. There was an iterative process on this on multiple sessions where we could be thinking about multiple ways to be enhancing policy and practices and what the service systems could look like in a way where we're thinking explicitly about how people with disabilities are fully included in the changing nature on the future of work, and how to make that work really well when we're thinking about these changes on policy and practice, and we're designing the systems around people with disabilities rather than people with disabilities being left out of the conversation. I think it would have been a travesty if we waited to have this conversation, say, 30 years from now when the technology would already be here. But I think we're at the right time right now to be thinking exactly on how the changing nature of work is going to be impacting people with disabilities. And later on in the panel, I can share also that the future work is also a major part of ODEP's work on the accessible technology sphere. I'll be sharing a little bit more that we have an initiative actually called Future Works, which aligns a lot with the conversation we're having right now on the panel, which our employment-related supports policy team has actually been spearheading as an outgrowth of our Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology, our longstanding National Technical Assistance Center on Accessible Technology. And I also just wanted to briefly say my appreciation also for the call out on the Workforce Recruitment Program, WRP, and my colleagues at ODEP who co-run that with DOD will appreciate that greatly. They sit a couple cubicles down from me, and WRP is one of the a program that we have had the great fortune of co-running with DOT to improve access for college students with disabilities and recent graduates to access to employment in the public sphere and the private sector. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So part of the summary really highlights these 6 specific recommendations. And I thought we could focus the conversation a little bit around what some of your ideas and suggestions would be in order to operationalize them, to see the successful measures that we hope and intended from putting together these recommendations. So if you'd like to kick it off, I thought maybe we could go.
I think Scott sort of brought up something which is really interesting. The idea of conversation. I think when we're talking about the future of work, we need to have entrepreneurs in this room. We need to have CEOs in this room. We need to have C-level executives. Because I think still the elephant in the room is the F word, fear. And it still is prevalent. So people who are at the C-level have to begin to have this conversation. I mean, it's fascinating to me, when I'm in a session and I'm dealing with specifically a lot of founders and entrepreneurs, they are 4 times as likely to have mental health issues than the general public. So they are dealing with disabilities themselves, and they understand that. But they're also hesitant because they also realize, okay, we need to figure this out. And it's interesting. I mean, I had a conversation, and I had this conversation several years ago with the provost of MIT. And he said to me, 60% of our student body is on the autism spectrum, right? I've said this to many people. And he said, so what does this mean? He said, every company, whether it's the stalwarts like Apple or Amazon or Google, have to think about how do we create a culture that is amenable to this community. Because every technology that we use on a day-to-day basis has the fingerprints of someone with a disability. And so if you ask that question, what does that mean? It means that we have to rethink the culture of work itself. How do we make it, and I'm not a big fan of the word accessible. I like the word adaptation and innovation. So it comes back to the place which is my sort of bailiwick, which is always imagination. And always thinking about, someone talked about the idea of truths. There's a philosopher by the name of Nelson Goodman. He always used to say, there is no such thing as truth. There are truths with a capital S. And so what are the truths of work for the 21st century? How do we think about this community, which is so needed? And I actually looked beyond MIT. I looked at Caltech. I looked at the University of Michigan. I looked at Stanford. And the numbers were very similar. So we all have to think, this is a tsunami. And it's a question of, this is just one community within the larger disability community. We have to think about it as, how do we begin to think about the disability community itself and the nuances and complexities of this community, and not only about employment, but the question of how do we create a culture of work so that new products, because I always think that out of necessity, the disability community has always been at the forefront of developing new products and services. Gallaudet University down the street here, 1977, was the origins of texting. You all use it, right? How many of you every single day texts? Well, you can thank the deaf community for that. And that's the reality. So when we think about innovation, we have to come back to this community. And we have to say, how do we mine this community? How do we use their brains? How do we use their lived experience as something that is enormously valuable? And it's not only valuable in terms of quality of life, it's valuable in terms of economics. And you know, I was in Budapest about a month ago, and they said to, you know, I was invited by the government, and the conference I was closing keynote, it was like a TED-like talk. And the idea was it was about creating value. They said, hiring people with disabilities isn't just a good thing to do. It's about our economic survival. And I wrote about this. I believe that it is inherent that companies not only hire people with disabilities, but change the culture. Because if we are in a workforce crisis, which Boston Consulting has written several pieces about sort of the workforce shortage. So if we are going to change that and change the course of this workforce shortage, we have to hire people with disabilities because it is about economic survival. So that is a mindset. If we look at it from that way, it speeds up the process. And I have really talked about this in terms of the context of climate change. But I look at it from the perspective of human sustainability, rather and say that as part of the sustainability conversation. So for me, this is something that is needed now, today. All right.
I really like your conversation, too, around the culture change piece, because one of the concerns I had when we call anything the future of work,
Yeah.
it sort of outdates itself the minute it's published,
Right.
in a way. But convening conversations and creating workplaces that are inclusive and ongoing, sort of in the same archetype, the same way that we developed this report, the way that we collaborated together on this project.
Yeah, I would call it cultural evolution.
Yeah, evolution.
As opposed to change. Because if you use the word evolution, it's constantly evolving.
Yeah.
And it's not static.
Yeah. And we'll need to create workplaces where we hear from the very people that we're trying to affect change for. So I think
And
that's
that
incredibly...
conversation is
yeah.
critical. That needs to be going on constantly.
Absolutely. So thank you so much. Now, Elena, in terms of the education system and our recommendations, let's talk about the role that educators play.
Sure.
Do you have any thoughts and suggestions?
A lot of thoughts.
I'm sure you do. Around, how can we really start emphasizing the role that educators play in preparing students for the future of work, and an ongoing discussion around how we prepare them for success in this new world of working?
Sure. So, a point on teachers, and then I'll back up for a minute. The teachers are not the only piece of the education system that's important and that matters for this population, but they're a really big one. And they are not prepared well enough now, and they will tell you that. The National Center for Learning Disabilities recently did a study looking at general education teachers, and 17% of general education teachers, feel very well prepared to teach students with disabilities. Not a specific type of disability, just in general. That's the answer. 17% of your public school teachers that are general education teachers. Half of them don't feel like they can implement an IEP or a 504. They're all doing that. They all have to. I mean, all teachers in public schools at this point are interacting and serving in some way at some time students with IEPs and 504s. So the fact that half of the teachers don't feel prepared to do that is a major, major problem. That's a teacher prep problem, for one, that our teacher preparation programs are not really set up to give teachers the skills, the information they need to go into a classroom and really understand how to teach students with disabilities, or really develop the supports that they need in order to serve all those students. But it's not just to teachers. They oftentimes don't have the supports, the paraprofessionals they need, the other people in the building. They don't have the connections with the others that they need to within the building and outside. So the IEP meeting is a good example. So that's an individualized education plan. So if you're not in the special ed world, this is where you get together to talk about a student's individual plan, the IEP. That when you go to an IEP meeting, it's like it can be 17 people, it can be 5, but it's always a lot. It's usually like a room of people. And that's by design. That's because IDEA set out the IEP to be a partnership. It has to be actually, parents engaged in this process, but it usually involves teachers, gen ed teachers. It involves special resource teachers. It involves therapists sometimes advocates, always an administrator, usually someone from the district. So you've got this real partnership. Now that is the potential to really, really serve kids well. But it's not really working in a lot of ways. That's in part because the teachers don't have what they need. They aren't prepared well enough, and they don't have the resources that they need. It's also because the system itself is highly bureaucratized now in a way that is to serve students. It's a protective mechanism. That is also part of IDEA, where you have procedural safeguards in place. That's an important part of the law, but it also means that you lose sight of when we talk about user-centered design, you lose sight of what this whole thing is for. This is so students and teachers and parents can figure out how to serve the individual needs of students. So before 1975, before IDEA, or what would be then called IDEA, students with disabilities were not well served. If they were served at all, many of them were excluded altogether from the education system. We have a system in place now that can work, and there are a lot of positives. Since that time, it's the percentage of students that are students with disabilities that are now in general education, that are mainstreamed. More than 80% has more than doubled. So that's a good thing. That's what we wanted. We wanted inclusion. We wanted to mainstream students so students are together. You don't isolate students with disabilities. But that's a positive thing in a world where we also have a lot of challenges. So the high school graduation right now nationally is, I think, 85%. Do you know what it is for? It's 20 points lower, 20 percentage points lower for students with disabilities. And that's just on average nationally. If you look by states, there's huge variation. The last, I think it's from 2017 data, but Mississippi says 37% or 33%. I don't know, maybe let's give them 37. But really, we're not graduating those students. The students that do go on to 2-year or 4-year universities, they're less likely to graduate. They usually don't finish in the 6 or 8 year span, and they're less likely to go on and get jobs that have earnings that are the same as others. There's just a whole slew of things that pertain to this future of work that are starting there in those really early years. And I'll also throw a flag up. We do a lot of work on early education here at New America. We have an early education team. That early intervention part is huge. Right? This is this moment. Not all people with disabilities, of course, are born with them. Many, many acquire. Most of us in our lifetime, it probably will. But many people are born with disabilities. And they enter a system where you can get services. We have services in place. We have a law that is designed to serve these children and platforms set up to do that. But if you look around and try to figure out how that works, you're going to find manuals and guides and consultants and all sorts of things that are going to make your head spin. And that's not the way it has to be. And I think if we settle back a little bit into a lot of the user-centered design principles that we talked about in the process that we went through, we would find that there's a way to serve students and the individual needs of students in our public education system in a way that really does serve all students and doesn't lead to a lot of the negative outcomes we have.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. And I'm noting a lot of emphasis now. In fact, in your bio, I was reading about the apprenticeship. Of course, when I was at Department of Labor, that's a big earn while you learn model, non-traditional models to equip students and really anyone with the ability to get hands-on learning experience. Do you see in any of the recommendations that we've put together in our report any emphasis on making that more inclusive and thinking through, from the educational system perspective, how they can make sure that we're giving access to individuals with disabilities through the public school system and those kinds of modalities?
Well, I mean, one of the recommendations talks about having one single interface or platform that would reduce redundancies and improve efficiencies. Yeah. So I think on a broad level that plays a role, because this birth all the way through, the idea is, the goal is that you'd have seamless supports throughout, and that seamlessness is the problem. There are just seams everywhere. And apprenticeship is one way that New America is actually playing a big role in it. We have a partnership to advance youth apprenticeship here at New America that's trying to figure out a way to bring apprenticeship down into high schools. So we have apprenticeship systems for adults, but we're trying to pull them down and see how could you start that earlier so that you can get students engaged not just in career exploration or maybe in CTE courses, but in actual pathways that are structured and that can pull you up into the workforce in a very real way. And I think that alignment, those connections, are really important, something that come out in this recommendation, certainly what New America is working on. And secondly, I'd say there's a recommendation around IEPs into voc rehab, that is a fallout point for sure. Back to the high school grad rates I mentioned and college attainment. You go through a process where you have an IEP. I mean, you could speak to this on a personal level. At some point, I'll have to speak to it on a personal level when my daughter's older. You get to this point where you are, in most states it's 16. The age 16, you start talking about, for the IEP, you should start talking about voc rehab, the voc rehab process. Even that doesn't sound right. When you're, as a parent, teacher, they're like, what is the voc rehab system? What does that have to do with what it doesn't make any sense. The language doesn't make sense, the terminology doesn't fit, and the process itself doesn't always work. And so if you're eligible, and there's an eligibility, this is a separate system. Like voc rehab, not the same. So you have an education system that's trying to grapple with, in the early years, which is an IFSP into an IEP. Then all of a sudden you have an IPE, which is your individualized, what is it, employment plan, yeah. So you've flipped the letters. So you've got people with the acronyms, like trying to make sense of this, and really trying to figure out how to guide parents and students into and up into the workforce to give them the supports they need. That recommendation in particular I think is important because it's connecting at this fallout point where we really do have parents and young people who are not, they can't figure out what to do, so they just don't. And that's a real big problem that I think we can tackle. It's not that we can't solve it. We just have to have the will and the partnerships and the people who are committed to making that happen.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Scott, you mentioned the Future Works initiative at ODEP. Let's talk a little bit about automation, technology, and the impact of what you're seeing and what you're working on maybe at ODEP, and then maybe you could even put it into context in terms of what you saw in the recommendations and think through some of the things or share some of your perspectives there as well and what we could do to really make some measurable results and see the successes that we want to see.
Yeah, so thank you. And one of the things I just also want to spotlight right before I talk about our Future Works initiative is, it was mentioned apprenticeship. So we do also have currently almost $2 million demonstration project going on right now called the Apprenticeship Inclusion Models Initiative, which is, has 4 different pilot sites on healthcare, advanced manufacturing, information technology, on improving access to inclusive apprenticeship for youth and adults with disabilities. So if you go to our contractor's website for that, spra.com/AIM, you can find out more about that. And that dovetails a lot with our work. And one of our contractors is working on that actually also runs our partnership on employment and accessible technology, or PEAT. PEATworks.org is the website. And it's a National Technical Assistance Center that we have been running for several years now on improving full access to technology in the workplace and in training processes, et cetera, for people with disabilities. And an outgrowth of that process was that we were seeing a lot more conversation dialogue on the changing in nature of future work on automation, artificial intelligence, automated vehicles. We've done a lot of work, actually, especially on that automated vehicle space for improving access to transportation to work for people with disabilities. My colleague, Lindsay Teal, who is currently detailed over the Department of Transportation, is a real great expert in that space. And we have a real synergy with the work that we're doing at ODEP on our Future Works initiative, which we launched to expand this work on this in the last several months, which really dovetails a lot with the recommendations here in the report on the changing nature on technology and how it's going to impact people with disabilities. And one of the facets is, if you look at the positive end, there's tremendous potential for it to open up new opportunities for, say, analytics about accommodations, workplace accommodations, to thinking outside the box. We could have artificial intelligence to think about new ways of approaching adjustments for people to make sure you have full access to work. There's many different ways artificial intelligence, virtual reality, extended reality could be a positive and help folks with tapping their talents and skills in the workplace and in that job search process to be able to find opportunities for employment that fit one's talents and skills. On the other hand, one of the things we also saw out there with the challenges is that the automation can also create difficulties with screening out people with disabilities from processes. From automated interviews, they're actually doing interviews now that are sometimes like an automated phone call, almost like an AI-type system which just guides you for the questions rather than a human being. And the problem is, how do you even request for accommodations on the fly if it's an automated system and not a human being? So there's real issues that we had concerns about in a lot of these different areas that we're exploring. So our Future Works initiative includes 3 different components: the existing work on accessible work technology, the automated vehicles or driverless cars, autonomous vehicles, another way of expressing that, and this focus on artificial intelligence, extended virtual reality, the Internet of Things, automation of tasks, just the real changing nature on technology, and to get ahead of that. I feel we're even ahead of the curve, I think, at the Department of Labor, the work we're doing at the Office of Disability Employment Policy, and I think it fits really well with the recommendations in the report on collaboration, for coming together, on sharing data, on having, we're talking this continuing conversation to be making sure there's the collaboration and partnership, and when we're talking on the changing nature of technology and changing nature of supports and skills, to make sure people with disabilities are fully included with supports we need, and that we mitigate the problems and we magnify the benefits on what these new technologies can actualize for improving access to economic self-sufficiency, integrated community living, and competitive integrated employment for all people with disabilities. I mean, I think we have tremendous potential on that. You can learn more, again, at peteworks.org to see more about our initiative in this space on FutureWorks as we examine more of that impact on it. And one of the other things I wanted to mention on there, for instance, the report also mentions other things that we discussed that are here right now that'll grow more is this sort of the gig economy and teleworking and telecommuting, because we're doing a lot more virtual access to the workplace. It's not like 70 or 80 years ago where people went to just a brick and mortar building and they stayed in there for 8 or 10 hours, or now people are doing all virtually or partially virtually, or working multiple jobs. I mean, that's sort of the changing nature of our economy, and I think we have to get ahead of that and be aligned with those changes that have been happening right now and that will continue to happen. And I think that's why it's great to having these continuing conversation and a continuing dialogue. That let this be a way to kindle more future engagement and conversation on this in the future, as we have the partnerships among all of us and other organizations in this room to be having this in the space and be having continuing sharing of data, resource information in communities of practice and in other initiatives that grow out of this work. And I think I have great fortune that at ODEP, the Office of Disability Employment Policy, collaboration is our mantra. Yeah. It is our, it is the major aspect of what drives our work. We're a relatively small agency, and by having collaboration, we can magnify the impact that we have on improving access to opportunities in gainful employment. So folks with disabilities, people with disabilities, youth and adults with disabilities can not only attain employment, but succeed, thrive in the employment, and advance in careers. Because it's not just about jobs, it's career pathways and how they align with this changing nature of work. And I am so fortunate that, as I say, this report, I think, fits into what we're already doing on our activities in this future work space. And, for instance, also on other areas like the inclusive apprenticeships and the executive order we have in that space from the president from a couple of years ago on how we can be training for these changes in the workplace, where they're changing the nature of tasks and skills, and to be adapting and get ahead of the curve on that and make sure folks with disabilities have full access to opportunities to, again, realize the American dream in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I move on to Isabel, you were mentioning remote work, telework, of course. That's our sweet spot, and I work with more than 50,000 employers who offer these kinds of offerings, and it's only on the rise. Did you see anything in the report, or is there anything you're working on specifically to have better conversations with employers around making these options more accessible and ensuring that we're not leaving out certain communities too? Employers right now are faced with the tightest labor market in a long, long time, but there's still such a huge community of great talent that they could be looking to tap into, and especially with remote and telework options and flexible options, it seems more viable. Anything you're doing or anything you saw in the report recommendations-wise, and how we could be messaging this better with employers?
Well, I think I love how it was mentioned in the C-suite that we have to meet employers where they are. Yeah. So I think whenever we're talking about the conversation on employment, is to make it employer-centered, and that was a major aspect of learning and learning curve for me when I came to ODEP. I had experience more with the system in developmental disabilities and the broader system on disability services and vocational rehab and other aspects of improving access to employment for people with disabilities. But the employer perspective was something that was newer to me, and our folks on our employer team, and we have a TA center on that, AskEarn.org, has helped give me the perspective that it's all about talents and skills, and to be packaging in that and hitting that home, just continuing that message. You just have to be continually emphasizing and put that more forward to employers, that it's because they want to see that talent. They care more about that than the underemployment or the unemployment. The underemployment and unemployment is important to us. And to make sure we can make sure it's also important to employers is to be focusing on the benefits that people with disabilities bring to the workplace. And with that changing nature of technology, telework, et cetera, we can be emphasizing how one of the things that we spotlight is how giving folks access to opportunities to work remotely, say partially or some or all the time, can be enhancing their productivity and performance. That accommodations in that space are all about enhancing how folks can meet the mission of agencies, organizations, and a lot of folks, for instance, at ODEP, I telework sometimes myself, and many of my colleagues do telework. Some of the time, we actually have a couple of folks who telework a lot, pretty significantly, and I think it enhances the work they're able to do, and it enhances their productivity, their performance, and it just fits with the way they want to go about being able to do their work. And we have that benefit in the federal government, and I enjoy seeing it also in the private sector, that we can emphasize that giving access to opportunities like that for people with disabilities can enhance your ability to tap their talents and skills.
Yeah.
And that applies equally, not just with telework, but to any other accommodations. That it's about being able to enhance how folks can be able to have that full impact on the mission of the agencies and organizations, and that accommodations are a positive for agencies and organizations, and often like with telework, they don't really cost much money. Often they just cost a little, not quote unquote cost, a bit just on enhancement of our attitudes around that in a positive manner of realizing that they benefit the organizations when they look at it for the long haul.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Isabel, what workforce trends are you noting either on an international or national scale that are creating success for individuals with disabilities as you're thinking about future of work? Or were there any information in the recommendations that you would want to talk to specifically around workforce trends?
Well, I'll speak to the international trends. The U.S. has not ratified the Convention on the Rights for Persons with Disabilities, but 180 countries have. And so we have 180 countries out there. They're implementing the CRPT by their own national laws and policies, and they're looking for other models. Like, how did they do it in this country? And they're looking to the U.S. because when we sent our delegation to the United Nations, it was really the Americans with Disabilities Act and our other federal laws that the CRPD is based on. So they look to us as an expert. And so there's an exciting opportunity right now. There's the Office of International Disability Rights Act that's on the Hill, and we're educating members of Congress about that. Because in that office at the Department of State, it's not just about diplomacy, it's about other countries being able to say, we need these experts, and the State Department being able to say, yes, we have a great pool of experts in this area, let's work together. So we've got that going on with the CRPD, and then we have the US commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals, which are obviously tied heavily to the CRPD. There's several SDGs that are coincide with the CRPDs. They're very much aligned in several areas. So we need to look closely at that to see if there's ways that we could use the SDGs, leverage the SDGs in this country when we think about the future of work. And lastly, Shane had mentioned the ILO event, the Global Disability Business Network event that was held in Geneva towards the end of last year. Shane and I were there, and we were on a panel, and they released a publication, their own Future of Work publication, and I was really excited to see that they're talking about climate change.
I know.
That word that shall not be mentioned. And other, demographic areas and other areas that kind of went outside of what we talked about in our immersive design studio. So it was good to see, but what I have a concern about is the international community isn't where we are right now in employment. we are just doing remarkable things, and we need to really, applaud ourselves for what we have done and our commitment to what's going to go on in the future. But they're not there yet. And when I brought up the issue, and it's one of the recommendations of long-term services and support, personal care attendance services in the workplace, their focus was, yes, that will grow the care economy. They gave no focus to the person that would actually be employed, would not be dependent on government support. They would have, they would have a job. They would have a good quality of life. They would be contributing to the economy. There's a great return on investment there. I tried to get them excited about it, but it didn't happen. They're just not there yet. And I think we have so much to offer the international community. And I think we need to be very proactive in engaging that community as we're having conversations like this.
I want to have something, I have something to add to that. And that is sort of, I think what Isabel said is absolutely true. But I think that there is a way to do it. If we look at what happened with the World Economic Forum and the Business Roundtable, and I think you have to sort of at least shift the conversation within the corporate realm. Both the Business Roundtable and the WEF came out with their definition of a corporation. What does it actually mean? And they expanded their definition, that it isn't just about driving revenue, that it is about what does it mean for employers, the fact that a corporation actually has a responsibility. So I think it's really important that we leverage that new understanding, and I'll sort of say it, that new mindset of what an organization deems their responsibility of a corporation should be, that it should be about diversity and inclusion, that we should value employees, that we need to really take care of our employers, both the employer and employee. And I think it's really important that we look at that new definition, both from the Business Roundtable and the World Economic Forum, and say, okay, how does disability fit into this? Because I think it fits nicely into it. And so while you're having a I know we're in Washington, D.C., but my world, I think I sort of go between. And since as I said to you before, I'm the professional stranger, I have to look at things from a sort of a broader perspective and say, okay, how do we match what is going on within the policy end of it to the business end? And the other aspect is language.
Yeah.
Because the language that you speak about policy, corporations don't speak that. There are two divergent languages. And so the question is, how do you find a translator? And we have to translate the language that you're speaking about so that it's palpable to C-level executives, and vice versa. Because I think in many ways, you've talked about the personal experience. I'm somebody with the right hemiparesis, a form of CP. So yes, I understand it. But it's not as relevant to a CEO that comes in or a C-level executive. They want to say, okay, what's the value proposition here?
Exactly.
Why is this important to me? And not only do I see this in my consulting work, I actually hear everything in my private practice as a clinician, because their job, I listen to people complain. I spend a lot of time listening to people complain about their companies. What do I need? How do I do this? And they're being very real and very raw. And if you understand their problems, and you say, well, here is a solution. Because I look at disability from 2 points of view. I look at disability with the small d, and I look at disability from the big D. The big D is the community. The small d is, how do you define disability as a management tool? And anyone who's read my writing will understand it, so I'm not going to explain it at great length. but you have to look at it from two narratives. And I believe that disability has a place as a management tool. And actually, the lived experience of disability is essential to innovation and should be taught at every business school in the country and beyond. And so we have to reframe how we think about disability as a key component to strategy.
Now, Jonathan, part of one of the key recommendations, there was a theme around social identity.
Yeah.
And you write about that in your Forbes article, too. Could you speak briefly about your thoughts around social identity and what some of the recommendations are in terms of the report?
Yeah.
And then we can close out with some final thoughts and open it up for some questions.
I mean,
Thank you.
I think social identity, there are multiple. I write about this a lot, and I've been thinking about this for the last 20 years of my life. There are two elements that are really important, and that is media. And when I say media, that is sort of broad definition, whether it's film, television, social media. Our definition of disability is changing. People who are part of this community are now being able to have conversations and take their identity back and reframe it and repackage it and bring it out to the public. So how do we think about disability is changing because people are controlling the narrative. And there are multiple narratives, actually, when you really think about that definition of disability. It is, as I said in the beginning, it is not a monolithic community. It runs across race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomics, and so on. So it is the essence of diversity. So when we think about disability, we have to sort of broaden the palette, so to speak, and really understand, okay, what are the values that we have to explain, and how do we define disability? And it is a broad definition. And it gives it, there's something beautiful in that, because there isn't one way to think about it, and it doesn't box us in. And so I think that's really critically important. How that relates to business will be the next step. And I don't have an answer to that. That is a question. And the question is ongoing. And will always continue to be a question. But I think that any business, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're a Fortune 500 company or so on and so forth, has to understand what is the value proposition for us as an organization. Not only just about hiring, because once we hire, we have to think about the life cycle of someone's work. Yeah. And how is that defined? Because I think it is critical. One of the issues I have had, and this is just mine, and this is my bias, yes, is that we're always talking about employment. I think we have to say, okay, that is the foundation. Yeah. Now we have to move beyond and thinking about products and services. I wrote a piece recently, and I actually, 20 some odd years ago, when I was a graduate student, I met Alexander McQueen, who, if any of you know, was a very famous fashion designer. And I spent 6.5 months with him while I was doing my fieldwork. And one of the things that he was doing was he was introducing models who were amputees to the catwalks of Paris, New York, London, Milan. And one of the reasons he wanted to do that, because he said, I want to reframe the idea of beauty. I want to reframe the idea of beauty not only by showing my beautiful clothing, I mean, he's a wonderful guy, but I want people to rethink what is that definition. Now, that was 20 years ago. Now that has changed. You can go onto Instagram or social media and see wonderful designers, but also an understanding of how we define disability is changing, and technology has been the conduit to that.
I think that's such a great point, and this project, in a sense, can serve as a model for changing the dialogue. Absolutely. For those who have control over policy, programs, advocacy, employment, all of the above. Why don't we start at the end and do some final thoughts around how can we maybe leverage this project model as an example moving forward to make sure that it does stay at the forefront of the conversation?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point that emphasizing when we're leveraging this project is that collaboration, that continuing conversation on sharing information and resources and data. Data was one of the things that was hit home on this, and it was integrated into the report, and that's always been an issue, I think, for having good access to qualitative and quantitative data. As a researcher, I take it especially to heart, what's emphasized in the report on the recommendation, and there are other aspects on we can be doing enhancing policy and practice, and I love that we're framing this when we're talking about how to approach this from employer-centered and that diversity inclusion aspects, the intersectionality, that people with disabilities come from diversity on socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, communication means, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to be keeping all this at the forefront when we're talking, as we're moving this dialogue forward, to be enhancing opportunities for people with disabilities in the workplace. And I just can't stress enough how, as I say, the emphasis, mitigating the challenges that come up and emphasizing the positives on how accommodations and supports and services as the changing nature of work and changing nature of technology in the workplace happens can be enhancing and is the value proposition, is the benefit to employers. And that's one of the things also that our job accommodation at work, our technical assistance center on workplace accommodations also emphasizes, that the accommodations can be helpful for the employee and that they can be helpful for just the productivity and performance that they have there in the workplace. And as I shared earlier, a lot of accommodations, the average accommodation doesn't cost any money at all. The ones that do cost money are in the hundreds of dollars, not the thousands of dollars. There's a lot of myths out there on workplace accommodations. Yep. And I think that's a critical part as we're carrying this conversation forward, to be thinking more on we actualize these recommendations and keep engaging and continuing conversation on this changing future nature of work and changing technology and supports and services, that these adjustments, accommodations can happen. Yeah. We can make them happen, and that there'll be a benefit to employers, not a negative, that those who are creating the jobs, that they'll find that it enhances their ability to perform and do their work. And it fits naturally and aligns very well with what was mentioned on the employee life cycle. It's not just about employment. It is about that full life cycle that we have in the workplace, and the full career aspects as it changes for people with disabilities, just as it changes for people without disabilities, and making sure those supports are in there to be tapping the talents and skills.
Absolutely.
As we're thinking on the skill shortage, that people with disabilities are a vital part of addressing that skill shortage and making sure that our economy here in America continues to be robust as our changing nature of work occurs. And just one last thought that I also wanted to mention too is that it was mentioned earlier that there's a fear factor around this, and there was also a fear factor if you look historically at the Industrial Revolution, many different critical points in when our economy changed, and we moved forward, and it was a positive, I think, to here in America and a lot of other countries. So I think we should, if we look at it as a positive, and just be proactive when we look at it as a positive, and to have these conversations at the forefront, I think we'll be well prepared, and we'll be able to make sure that this is a benefit. And I look at this as an opportunity to make sure that more people with disabilities can actually access gainful work, that the changing nature of our economy and changing nature of technology will open up doorways. And we need to make sure the conversations continue, and we have discussions on sharing information, resources, and our values through things like communities of practice and doing demonstration projects around this work. So I look forward to continuing collaboration and partnership in this work with all of everybody here in this room and our partners here on this panel.
Thank you. And Elena, as it relates to the education system, policymakers, final thoughts?
So I think that to use you had the big D and the little d, so I'll say a big E and a little e for education. I guess the little e, the education system, just to reinforce that it's in kindergarten or first grade that you get asked, what are you going to be when you grow up? And they go around the room and people write that down. That is the point when your occupational identity is just starting to form and you're trying to figure that out. We have got 7 million, that's 14% of the population in our public schools that are students with disabilities. That doesn't even include the students that have 504s. So these are students just with IEPs. That's a lot of young children who are starting to get messages about what they can be when they grow up and where they can go and whether this world is built for them or not built for them. whether it's inclusive or it's not inclusive. So that biggie, the education component of this is really important. I don't know whether little or big. The other E is education in general, that I think there's a huge education component to this, related sort of to the fear maybe around work change, but also around disability. There just is a there's a real lack of understanding and comfort with talking about disability. We do a lot of work at New America around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We talk about it a lot. We try to be inclusive. We don't talk about disability enough. We don't talk about disability well. And I think that's probably true of most of the peer organizations in Washington, D.C., policy, research, and otherwise, certainly for our funders and for other people that we work with. And that can be changed, but that is a process of educating and familiarizing people with the issue, with the terms. People aren't trying necessarily to feel that way, but they feel that way, and that is a huge barrier. If they don't want to talk about it, they won't talk about it, and we won't do anything. So that's my final thought on the big and little E.
Yeah, thank you. Isabel, you had made some comments around, using what's working really well here in this nation on an international scale. So thoughts around how we can take what we've done really well on this project and leverage it as we continue the conversation and move it forward.
I think the process itself, the immersive design studio, I would encourage a lot of the different federal agencies and corporations to look at that process. The systems mapping was incredible. I never thought I would agree with anybody in the room at the beginning of the process, but to see everybody's vantage points was very, very interesting.
Absolutely.
So as I think about internationally, the Department of State and USAID are developing their policies and asking for stakeholder input, I think they should really look at this particular process. Mm-hmm. But going back to what you just said about the E, I just wanted to throw out there that isn't it an amazing thought that we could have small or medium-sized businesses around America actually engaging with schools to say, here's what we need. How can you redesign the curriculum so that you've got students that actually graduate with the skills that we need, right? There's a thought. The other thought that I had was, next steps on this particular report are important. So all of the federal agencies should be looking at the recommendations. The federal government is a fabulous incubator when it comes to demonstration projects and community of practice. I'd like to see what their next steps in this process are going to be, but also we've got to reach out to the folks on the Hill. Mm-hmm. So I would encourage leadership in this process, SourceAmerica and New America, to engage with legislators and to hold a Hill briefing. The U.S. International Council on Disabilities have had some great results as in that process of educating congressmen and women on the various issues. They react well. So there's my other thought.
Thank you.
And my last thought is that there's some great things going out there with organizations like Disability In and the National Organization on Disability, the Disability Equality Index. I encourage you all to look into that. They're really engaging with those larger companies out there, and I just heard recently that 6 companies have started providing personal care attendant services in the workplace. Mm-hmm. That's massive. They're not relying on some healthcare plan to do it. They're just doing it because it's the right thing to do, and it's proven that it's not going to cost a lot of money. And how do I know that? Because Section 501 of the Rehabilitation Act has been providing personal care attendant services. And if you look at the final rule and the questions and answers around that, all of the documentation is there to show we can do this and American corporations can do this. So I'm very excited to share that. And that was my final thought, I promise.
Perfect. Last and final thought?
I have a couple of things. I'm going to put my therapist hat on for one moment. It's important to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And that is a critical aspect of this conversation. And one of the other things, we have a lot of like-minded people in this room. We have to make it more diverse. We have to get people who think of disability as an unknown, and get people who are uncomfortable with this conversation because they're unfamiliar, and say, let's begin the dialogue. Let's really get into this. As Isabel said, well, you know, it's great that they have personal care attendants, but why? For a corporation, because it increases productivity. And one of the things that I would think about is we need marketing people in this, because we have to brand this very differently. Disability needs a new brand. It absolutely does. If we are going to live in the 21st century economy, if we are going to live in a way where we have to present disability in a new way, we have to brand it in a new way. It's been branded in the same way for the last 70 years. It's done. As far as I'm concerned, we need a lot of marketing and branding professionals to say, okay, how do we rethink this? You know, businesses always do this. Perception is reality. So what is the perception of disability today, and what will it look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and so on? So I think that has to be a critical piece of the conversation. So the two things I leave with, you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable in this conversation, and two, what does the new disability brand look like, and why is it valuable for corporations?
Thank you so much. And I have a few final thoughts also, if I could share before opening the floor for questions. I think first and foremost, it's what each and every one of you can do. It's to make sure that you're sharing the report findings, the recommendations, what you heard today, maybe the recording of today's session, inviting some of the great collaborators that you see here to come and speak and work with your organizations, because I spent a lot of time in the federal space, and this is a perfect example. This project is such a great example of what we all talk about when we think about public-private partnerships and collaboration. It cannot be done just by private sector. It cannot be done by investors. It can't be just done at local communities or at the federal policy level. It takes a village, and you are part of that. So I very much encourage you to make sure you have access to the report, that you share it with parents, advocates, community advisors, all of the above, in the hands of media. And I just want to give our panelists a very warm round of applause for their thoughts. So, oh yes, and we'd love to give our interpreters a warm round of applause as well. Thank you so much for being with us and helping. So with that, let's hear from you. Do you have any questions? Raise your hands high. Okay. Are we going to go over here? Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yes, hello, thank you, and
Hi.
panel. Great job. I'm with you. My name is J.D. Collier, and I'm working on a startup that I call Eagle Impact. And John, thank you for bringing up brand, okay? My brand is called Eagle Impact, and I am focusing on the post-service community, people from the armed forces, law enforcement, fire and rescue, and spouses. I lump all of that group into what I call an eagle. So, for instance, I don't call you a veteran, I call you an eagle. Veteran, like disability, has had its better days, the term, in my opinion. So that's why I'm raising the elevation. I'm calling you an eagle, okay? So I like where you're going with that. My question is about how, on the value proposition side, how do we make companies have a coolness factor because they're including people with disabilities? How do we do that? And I know one example is, you know, a lot of people, I have an iPhone, you know, Apple. Most of Apple's value, most of the company's value it's not real assets. It's just this coolness factor. It's like intangible. And so how can we make disability inclusion to be something intangibly valuable?
Well, it's interesting. I'm going to mention Caroline Casey for a moment. And anyone who knows her, she's in London, actually, at the moment. She's about to take a 3-month sabbatical. She is a force of nature. The reason I mention her is she created an organization called the Valuable 500. And one of her major partners was Richard Branson and Virgin Media. And so she came about it as, this is a campaign. And we have to reshape how we look at disability. And what she has done is, and her organization has said, okay, we are going to look at disability from a very new perspective. We are going to change the perception. And how we look at this community is saying, she uses the word diversion. And so saying, okay, we're going to use language. And as you have done, you're sort of using EAGLE to say, how do we get people involved with expanding the language, expanding our understanding, expanding this? And she's all over British and European media. She's not here yet. But I think it's a great case study in understanding how media is used. Another example are people that there are wonderful illustrators that are looking at disability as superheroes and creating that value. Marvel actually has the sort of first deaf superhero, the first superhero with CP. So it's all a matter of perspective. How do we reframe disability as something, okay, it's just part of the lived experience. This is part of the human experience, but what makes it cool? You know, my friend used to call me Johnny Spaz growing up because I had a spastic right hemiparesis. That was just something that was really cool. I mean, I was called that since I was like 8. And he's the only one that calls me that, by the way. And it was the idea of saying, how do you take this that can be seen as a limitation and making it something that's really palpable? And so it's reframing the idea of disability not as a limitation, but as something that is enormously valuable. I mean, you know, we talk about the autism community because I think it's very prevalent now when we say, okay, this is a community that will have the fingerprint on every technology we use. Well, that is a change in perception. Now it's a question of, okay, how do we get branding gurus and marketing and advertising to say, okay, how do we use this differently? And I think a perfect example was the advertisement from Microsoft at the Super Bowl. It was seen by over 250 million people. It was about gaming. And the idea that whether you have a disability or not, the technology that was used by Logitech, it was a partnership between Microsoft and Logitech, said it doesn't matter who you are, you're a gamer. Yeah. Rather than a person with a disability, and you can join this community. So it's irrelevant whether you have a mobility impairment or not. You're just part of the larger gaming community, so that and it's unbelievable now what is going on in gaming and the disability community. So it's changing our perception. I'll end there.
Thank you. Down here in the front.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Francie Youngberg. I'm the VP for External Affairs at Melwood. And one of the things we started about a year ago is a program called Ability IT, and it's to train individuals of differing abilities. We specifically use the word differing abilities instead of disabilities, to your point about marketing, so that we can emphasize how we're all different and we have something to contribute. And so we have trained now at this point about 55 graduates. They are individuals of differing abilities and injured veterans in IT and cyber skills, which is, as you all know, has a shortage of workers. And we have a high unemployment rate for individuals of differing abilities and injured veterans. So we're trying to have those two problems solve each other. And so as we're moving forward, and out of the 55 that's graduated, 87% of them have found employment. So GDIT, KPMG have hired them, and we also have another 80 in the pipeline this year to go through the program. So my question really for the folks up on the stage is that on the public policy side, and on the SourceAmerica, New America, What we really need is a chance to be in front of more employers, because we are making a business case that this is the cost of doing business. It's not charity, although it's the right thing to do, but it is about the fact that you are paying headhunters 25% of someone's salary in order to hire somebody, whereas a Melwood can provide the services from identifying the person, training them, providing them with retention support, and even educating your workplace. Because for you to succeed, the workplace receiving you has to have the right frame of mind in order to know, how do you work with somebody on the autism spectrum. So from our viewpoint, that is a cost of doing business, just like they're paying already. And once our folks are hired, they're very loyal. They will stay in that job. So in terms of how many times do they need to flip that and their retention rate, so this is the case that we can make. And I believe that not just Melwood, the 450 other nonprofit agencies within SourceAmerica can make the same argument. But what we need is more convening on the federal side, on the state, and on the private sector side, because it's great that we have KPMG and GDIT, but they need to have a peer-to-peer influencing of other companies and say, it worked for us, it didn't cost that much money, and it actually did contribute to our bottom line. So the last thing I'll say is the Accenture study saying that that companies who hire people of different abilities are 28% more profitable. That is a great pair to this study. And so if you guys are thinking about what are the next steps, I'd be really curious to see how you're trying to lift up the efforts like what we're trying to do so that we can get in front of the right people for us to be successful. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. That's a great.
So I do think that as OPM is studying this report, and hopefully other federal agencies, that they look at the other reports that are out there. One of the exciting things I did when I was at HHS was a public analysis of over 4,000 comments, public comments. But then I looked at all of the reports published by NGOs and other groups and really built a great, strong strategic framework from that. And I'm really hoping that that happens. But I also want to talk about, getting in front of the other agencies or other companies. The workforce recruitment program, I just say, I think I'm one of the best cheerleaders for it. It's such a great system, and I think there needs to be a serious conversation about how do we take this into the public realm so that companies can find the skilled workers that they need and engage with the college disability service officers to say, here's the fields that we're looking for. Do you have any qualified, graduates, or you have something that?
Well, after you were done, I was just gonna. I was hoping to jump into.
Jump in. No,
okay.
jump in.
Yes.
Okay. So
This is your program.
I also wanted to kind of add on that I think dovetails nicely with that is that it's about the talent pipeline, about making sure that we're enhancing how we're having that perspective when we're thinking about, and I think we've innovated that over the years with examples like WRP and to the private sector, the public sector, but I think we can be doing an even better job. We're looking at nonprofit organizations, the commercial organizations. I mean, everyone can be aligned together and reading from the same choir book kind of thing. And I think we have a tendency to be siloed off on that talent pipeline. And I think with the skill shortage we have right now in technology, a lot of other technical areas, a lot of other aspects of our economy, which a lot of those skill shortages will continue to grow if we don't really adapt to it on thinking on how the pipeline of folks can be enhancing opportunities in businesses. So it's that employer-centered language coupled with that cross-connection to pipeline, and that employers are eager for this. I mean, they are eager for new talent and skills to be enhancing productivity in the workplaces. Just one quick example that I wanted to mention on that was for instance, on the autism hiring programs, that a lot of the managers out there were never able to see this talent because a lot of folks just like other folks with disabilities, could not get in the doorway, could not make it for the interview process with HR. And so being able to have just some adjustments in the processes that are more skill focused rather than the traditional interview, which is more about, just having some wonderful conversation that has nothing to do maybe with your day-to-day routines and duties in the actual workplace, but to be focusing it more on the skills that you would actually perform in the job and across your career. And I think we need to be thinking about that when we're having the conversation, and changing our perspectives around those talent pipelines is to making sure that it's aligned with what employers want and what organizations can be supporting, and that we should have a cross-connection on that.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I work with employers every single day, some of whom are hiring between 12 and 100 plus thousand positions every single year and can't get enough candidates in the door. In fact, Shane, I wanted to let you know that one of your nonprofits, Full Circle Employment, is one of our newest partners that we're working with to connect employers and their programs, similar to what you're saying. And they are looking for ways to have these conversations to inform your training and reskilling and upskilling programs in order to funnel candidates right into the jobs that they're hiring for. So these kinds of partnerships are exactly what it takes to move the needle. Thank you for that comment. Thank you for your answers. We have one more question over here.
Thank you. My name's Candy Chambers, and I actually lead a 501c6 trade association, and I talked to Charlotte a little bit ago, and we actually have about 920, 925 members of some of the largest government contractors in the country. And so any of you that have employees that need positions, we have a strategic partnerships division, and we actually find resources to help our members. All of the companies you mentioned are our members. So we can easily spread that word and educate them, give them the resources, and that's what we do. And our mission is to hire protected veterans, individuals with disabilities, females, and people of color, and provide those resources to our employer members. So
that's great.
Yeah,
I'm
so
sure they'll benefit from this report too.
Exactly.
So thank you. Thank you so much. Do we have time for any more questions? One more? Anyone? Right there in the middle of the room, sir. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I'm Chris from Respectability Policy Department. So my question goes to the ODEP representative. We looked at some statistics from the Disability Statistics Compendium that's related to the Census Bureau data, and indicating that between just 2016 to 2018 alone, there is tenfold drop in employment rate for persons with disability. So I will already say the future is already here. The problem is real, because if we are having employment rate going up for the general population, but those already on employment are dropping out, what is specifically your department doing with respect to some programs that give disincentive for work? Example is the SSI and then the SSDI programs sort of prohibit certain income levels. Yes. How are you maneuvering around eliminating those disincentives for work? Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for asking that question. I think that's a great question on the challenges and disincentives folks may have to work, in terms of sometimes there's a misalignment historically between our benefit system, and it's sort of different than it is internationally. You see in a lot of other countries where these are not necessarily interconnected. Some of that is, many folks, it's a longer conversation than we can have today about the history on why that's separated and disjointed. And we actually are running an initiative right now called Retain, that is about return to work, stay at work, that has demonstration projects, grants funded projects around the country in different states, looking at how we can be, not only integrated on the benefits counseling, but for instance, integrating on the cross-connecting to the healthcare system. A lot of the focus there for now was on like physical mobility, disability, health conditions, and mental health conditions. But I think the lessons learned from that initiative apply equally to what we're seeing across physical, sensory, and cognitive disability, on folks with disabilities having sometimes disincentives to work, on having areas where we can be enhancing policy and practice. And yes, when I see statistics where drops in labor force, or the still very significantly high underemployment, unemployment for people with disabilities, again, across cognitive, physical, and sensory disability, it's an issue. It's something that hits home. It's really impact for us. I think it keeps it real for us at the Department of Labor that for instance, in the Office of Disability Employment Policy and in our sister agencies, a lot of folks with disabilities work in our department too. At ODEP, a significant portion of us not only have disabilities, but came in for our affirmative action hiring under Section 501 of the Rehab Act for Schedule A, including myself. I came in for Schedule A. And so I take to heart with that personal perspective and with my friends and colleagues with disabilities that we need to be doing a better job to continuing to enhance and what we're looking on policy and practices. And maybe there's areas where we could be doing better on changing our perspective, working more with employers, taking a fresh perspective on different initiatives. And that's why we're trying different things out with our apprenticeship initiative, which fits already to our existing focuses on areas on training for skills and talents for folks with disabilities, to be enhancing work that can improve the productivity and performance for employers, and what skills and talents can mean for that. But I think we can still continue to do a better job and innovate and enhance ourselves on the policy and practice, and it definitely keeps us real for thinking on that perspective and to make sure that we're grounded on that. And I think we won't rest. We won't rest until we're continuing to make sure that folks with disabilities will eventually have equal opportunity and unlimited access to employment opportunities. And that is a long-term goal, and that is going to take a long-term time, a long-term pathway to get there, because the journey is immense in terms of the time, because it's been so many decades that people with disabilities have had the barriers to full employment access. And so even though ODEP's been around for 20 years, I think it's still going to be a while that our mission is going to be tackling this issue to make sure folks can access gainful employment. But I think we're still making great strides that aren't always reflected in the numbers at times related to the barriers, but it still keeps us focusing really on our mission moving forward. And it also does when we get calls and emails from folks who are living real lives right now on having barriers to accessing competitive integrated employment, that we can do better, and to continue to challenge ourselves, and to continue to challenge not only our federal partners, the rest of the federal government, but also in state and local government, and our organizations who are partners and collaborators here in the private sector and the nonprofit world. And you can help us do better in the federal government and help challenge all of us to be, when we see issues on numbers where participation is going down or employment is going down, that we can do a better job on that and be better innovative on how we can create better opportunities for folks with disabilities.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for all of your questions. You can find each and every one of these panelists on social media in some form, Twitter, LinkedIn, Forbes, what have you. And be sure to download the report. Final remarks?
Again, would just like to express our gratitude for you taking time out of your day to be here today. Thank you, New America, for hosting us and for all of your partnership. To the panelists, we look forward to continuing this work going forward, engaging with you after this through email, through meetings, through conversations. Thank you, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You guys are wonderful.